evolve these corn or strawberries or whatever.
No, I would be cautious going down that trail. The corn, they're selecting for size. If they get a mutant that is now larger size, okay, is that new information, or is that the same information gone haywire? There's no new. The corn didn't turn into a strawberry or banana or elephant. It is still corn. It's still recognizable as corn. So I don't think the mutation actually added anything. It accentuated something that was already existing. So I don't think that process is going to offer any hope to those who want all of humans to come from rocks over 4.6 billion years.
Okay.
Okay.
I think.
Well, let me point out one more thing, Jackson. One more thing.
Go ahead.
One more thing. This corn that they have produced, and I grew up in Illinois corn country. Believe me, we were surrounded by miles of corn. The corn is A, still corn. B, it is less resistant to diseases. You have to babysit it and spray it with all kinds of stuff. And it turned loose into the wild, it would very quickly revert in a couple generations, if it survived at all. It would revert back to the native original corn. So this is not something that is going to work in nature. It might work in a farm or in a laboratory where they can babysit it and keep it alive. But it has lost its disease resistance, it's lost its resilience, it's lost its toughness. I think there's a couple of other phrases that farmers will use for plants that are able to survive, without their help. So that example, if it were true that the corn has indeed evolved or mutated and created something new, if it were true, and I'm not saying it is, that is only one of about 40 quadrillion examples you would have to come up with to turn a rock to a human over 4.6 billion years.
Okay, so I think, and it's probably my fault, but I think we are talking about two different types of mutations. I think we're on two different sort of wavelengths when we talk about this.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, I agree with you completely when you say that it's built upon, that mutations are built upon the existing genetic material. I completely agree. Elephants don't, just come out of rocks magically or what have you. I agree.
Right.
But every variation, every mutation is adding to what's already there. And so when we pull those away, when we look at these mutations, over time we see a sort of family tree arising from these mutations, or from pulling them away. We see, okay, this mutation resulted in this lineage, and we see this mutation resulted in some other lineage. And so I agree, they are starting with a pre-existing material, but they are still adding information, I guess.
Well, that's where I would disagree. I don't think, this is a fairy tale that people tell. This is a story, but it's not observed in nature. We don't observe mutations add information that it's useful and then succeed in passing it on to the next generations. We don't see that in nature. So it's not really science. It's more of a religion. It's something people believe in, and they believe in it very strongly. And I have to admire their faith. But it's not science. Whatever it is, science is things we can see and test and observe and study and demonstrate. So it's not science. It is a story. It's if you give it enough time, it might happen. Well, okay. We've had farmers raising cows and pigs and corn and chickens and everything else for generations, thousands of years. And all we've ever seen is chickens produce chickens and cows produce cows. And if you get a mutation that's too far from normal, it dies. The second problem you have is if you did get a beneficial mutation, like you're mentioning here, I don't think there's an example of one. But if there was one, now you got a gigantic problem of who does this one marry? You got to get two mutations, identical, in the opposite sex, at the same time, in the same place. They got to find each other and be interested.
Well, that's not really how sex works. But it's not so much about two getting the same mutation at the same time. It's about one. Mutations are very incremental, and so a mutation that isn't within a certain range of incrementalness, whatever, is going to kill the organism, which is why we have all these mutations that are lethal, because they cause too much of a negative change in this organism. But that's right. So I want to go back to this idea of information. Can you give me a definition of that word? Does that just mean genes?
Well,
it just means genes.
The English language is based upon a code of 26 letters called the 26 letters of the alphabet. If you had mutations in your writing, if you were writing down in English and every once in a while you get a mutation, a misspelling, how long would it take that process of getting mutations or typographical errors or misspellings to turn your sentence into Russian or Chinese or Korean? Well, it won't happen. It doesn't happen. It can't.
I mean, we can. I'm sorry.
Well, it's based on a different code. See, adding letters or deleting letters or transposing letters in a sentence, as an example of a mutation, is not going to add new information, especially if anything wrong or negative is eliminated right away. And there certainly seems to be a process in nature called natural selection, where anything that isn't the best or toughest or strongest is going to be naturally eliminated. It's not going to survive. If the sheep can't run as fast as the rest of the sheep, well, then the wolf is going to catch him first. So he doesn't get to pass on his genes to the next generation. I don't think that mutations are incremental. I mean, you can imagine that if you want, but that's not science. It's something people imagine happening, and they tell stories about it, and they say, well, what if, and it's not science. Whatever it is, it's a religion, I think.
Okay. So I guess we'll talk about the. You mentioned languages as you're talking about mutation. Well, we can actually see the evolution of languages. We can see the evolution from Latin to Old Castilian, which is the colloquialism of Latin, or colloquial language of Latin, to Spanish, for instance. And we can see the evolution, if you want to call it that, in such works as Don Quixote, which has elements of both Old Castilian, which is the Latin colloquial language, and Spanish.
Sure.
So we can see.
Hold on. Let me give my input on that so far, and then you can go on. That is a poor example of using the word evolution, because that didn't happen by itself. There were a lot of intelligent people over the centuries who were making those changes. People in the last 100 years have come up with thousands of brand new words. I don't know that the word computer was in any dictionary 200 years ago. I don't think the word automobile was in any dictionary 100 years ago or 150 years ago. So, yes, we are our English language is evolving, if that's what you mean, but it's happening as a result of a lot of intelligent, or sometimes not so intelligent, input. So the Latin slowly evolving or morphing into the Spanish or any of the modern Romance languages, this is not happening by itself. It's happening because of intelligent input. That is not an example of what might happen in nature to turn a frog to a prince, or to turn a rock to a prince, which is what evolution really teaches. I mean, ultimately, you have to start with a rock. 4.6 billion years ago, the Earth cooled down. It was a hard, rocky crust. It rained on the rocks for millions of years, turned them into soup, and the soup came alive. And that first life form slowly became humans. I mean, that is exactly what the story says. I've got the textbooks. I'm surrounded by a library of these textbooks that teach that. So,
I believe you.
The changes that we see from Latin to Spanish is A, not going to help for the evolution of living forms. B, it's an example of intelligent input causing this to happen. Like the automobile turning into from the Model T to the Lincoln Continental. Well, that didn't happen by itself. A whole lot of engineers designed things and made them better. So that was an example of creation and intelligence. So I'm sorry, go ahead, I interrupted.
No, that's fine. Well, I was just making the analogy with language.
Right.
That wasn't meant to be as like this is a dead
Approved. It's not approved.
example of evolution. So I'm just making an analogy. As for the mutations, they are incremental. Everyone has approximately 130 mutations in their zygote alone, and the majority of these are neutral. That is, they don't express themselves, and this is understood in Kimura's neutral theory or neutral theory of mutation, I believe it's called. And so when we look at evolution over the billions of years, and we look at it in retrospect, and it seems kind of difficult to imagine that the single-celled organism eventually unconsciously gave rise to multicellular organisms and then to fish, amphibians, etc. But we have to realize, looking at that in retrospect, in every generation throughout evolutionary time, there was no conscious foresight of what any organism is going to turn into. Every organism was just going through mutation, natural selection, and speciation, and it ultimately resulted in us as well as all the other organisms.
Well, now, hold on. No. You think it ultimately did that. You don't know that. That is how the story goes, but that's not science. Nobody saw this happen. Nobody sees it happen today. It is a religious teaching that single-celled organisms became humans over slow periods of time, over billions and billions of years. That is certainly what you're being taught, and that is what you voiced here, but that is not part of science.